At 6:14 a.m. on February 21, 1945, Corporal James Jimmy Kowalski crouched in a waterlogged shell crater 40 yards from a Japanese Type 22 pillbox on Iwo Jima's western beach terrace, facing an estimated 15 enemy combatants firing from reinforced concrete apertures, while volcanic ash mixed with morning drizzle obscured visibility to 30 feet. Strapped to his back was an M22 flamethrower he'd modified with a crude pressure release valve fashioned from a captured Japanese canteen cap, and copper wire scavenged from destroyed communication equipment. The nearest supporting rifle company was pinned down 300 yards to the southeast behind a volcanic rock formation, cut off by interlocking fields of machine gun fire. In approximately 90 seconds, the pillbox's Type 92 heavy machine gun would traverse left and expose his position to direct fire. This is the story of a man who proved his worth not through medals or military academies, but through cold observation and the willingness to turn a weapon everyone feared into the tool that broke Japan's strongest defenses. The sound was what the men remembered first, not the screaming, not the explosions, but that distinct whoosh roar that announced Kowalski's presence on any contested position. It was a sound that made Marines cheer and Japanese defenders abandon positions that had held for days. But 6 months earlier, that same sound had made officers shake their heads and NCOs laugh behind their hands. Flamethrowers were considered suicide weapons, death sentences strapped to a man's back, useful only for desperate situations where you'd already accepted you weren't coming home. The official doctrine classified them as specialized equipment for engineer units, not something a regular rifleman should ever volunteer to carry. The casualty rates for flamethrower operators were among the highest in the Pacific Theater, higher than machine gunners, higher than bar operators, higher even than radio men who drew Japanese sniper fire like magnets. But Corporal Kowalski had seen something others hadn't, and on this morning, in the volcanic hell of Iwo Jima, he was about to prove that sometimes the most dangerous weapon isn't the one that kills from the greatest distance. It's the one that forces the enemy to face their deepest fears at point-blank range. James Kowalski was 23 years old when he landed on Iwo Jima, a second-generation Polish immigrant from Detroit who'd spent his pre-war years working in his uncle's automotive repair shop on Michigan Avenue. He stood 5'8", weighed 160 pounds, and possessed the kind of unremarkable face that disappeared in group photographs. His service record showed nothing exceptional: adequate marksmanship scores, satisfactory physical fitness ratings, completion of basic infantry training at Camp Pendleton. He'd been assigned to the 4th Marine Division, 23rd Regiment, as a replacement rifleman after the division's losses at Saipan and Tinian. What his service record didn't show was that Kowalski had a mechanic's mind, the kind that couldn't look at a malfunctioning piece of equipment without mentally disassembling it, identifying the problem and imagining a solution. In the Marines, this tendency made him useful for fixing jammed rifles and repairing damaged equipment, but it didn't earn him any special recognition. He was classified as a rifleman, and riflemen were expected to carry rifles, follow orders, and stay in formation. The flamethrower entered his life by accident during training exercises on Maui in late 1944. The division was preparing for the next island campaign, destination unknown to the enlisted men, though the intensity of the training suggested something bigger than what they'd faced before. During a demonstration of specialized weapons, an engineer unit brought out the M22 flamethrower, a 70-pound apparatus consisting of 2 cylindrical fuel tanks, a nitrogen pressure tank, an ignition system, and a nozzle and wand assembly that looked like something from a science fiction magazine. The demonstration went poorly. The first operator managed a weak 10-foot stream that sputtered and died. The second operator's ignition system failed completely, producing only a stream of unlit fuel that puddled uselessly on the ground. The third operator achieved a proper ignition, but the pressure was so inconsistent that the flame alternated between a weak dribble and a sudden gout that nearly caught the operator himself on fire. After 40 minutes of mechanical failures and increasingly frustrated engineers, the demonstration was called off. The company first sergeant made a dark joke about how the flamethrower was more dangerous to the operator than the enemy, and most of the Marines laughed and went back to their regular training. Kowalski didn't laugh. He watched the engineers pack up the equipment, his mechanic's brain cataloging every malfunction, every sputter, every inconsistency. He saw the problem immediately. The pressure regulation system was too crude, too binary. It was either on or off with no gradual control. The nitrogen tank fed pressure into the fuel tanks, but there was no way to bleed off excess pressure or adjust the flow mid-operation. It was like trying to drive a car that only had two speeds, stopped and full throttle. That evening, he approached the engineer platoon's tent and asked if he could examine one of the flamethrowers. The engineers, tired and embarrassed by the day's failures, initially refused, but Kowalski was persistent in a quiet, non-threatening way that eventually wore down their resistance. He explained that he was a mechanic, that he just wanted to understand how the system worked, that he wouldn't break anything. Finally, a corporal named Henderson shrugged and let him look. Kowalski spent 2 hours that night studying the flamethrower's mechanism by flashlight, his hands tracing fuel lines, testing valves, examining the pressure system. Henderson watched with mild amusement, occasionally answering questions about how the equipment was supposed to function versus how it actually performed in the field. The conversation was technical, focused, devoid of drama. "The problem," Kowalski said finally, "is you've got no way to regulate once you've opened the valve. It's all or nothing." Henderson nodded. "That's how it's designed. You pull the trigger, you get maximum pressure, maximum range, that's what the manual says. But maximum pressure also means maximum fuel consumption. You're burning through your load in 8 to 10 seconds, and half of it is just overshooting the target or creating excess flame that doesn't do anything useful. So what if you could control it? What if you could dial down the pressure for closer targets, conserve fuel, extend your operational time?" Henderson laughed, not cruelly, but with the weary resignation of someone who'd heard ambitious ideas before. "Kowalski, these things are built in factories by engineers who have spent years designing them. You really think you're going to redesign it in a tent on Maui?" "I'm not redesigning it, I'm just thinking about pressure regulation. In Detroit, we dealt with compressed air systems all the time, pneumatic tools, hydraulic systems, the principle's the same." "Maybe, but this isn't a car and I'm not authorized to let you start modifying military equipment. You want to carry one of these things in combat? Be my guest. They're always looking for volunteers, but you don't get to tinker with it." Kowalski thanked him and left, but the idea didn't leave his mind. To understand why flamethrowers were so feared, by both sides, requires understanding their brutal mathematics. The M22 flamethrower carried approximately 4 gallons of thickened fuel, a mixture of gasoline and a gelling agent that made it stick to surfaces and burn longer. When properly operated, it could shoot a stream of ignited fuel 40 to 50 yards, though effective combat range was usually much shorter. The nitrogen pressure system could maintain consistent pressure for about 8 to 10 seconds of continuous firing, or longer if used in short bursts. The problem was survivability. A flamethrower operator was carrying 70 pounds of highly flammable material on his back, connected to a pressurized system with an ignition source at the front. If a bullet punctured the fuel tanks, the result could range from a slow leak to a catastrophic explosion, depending on whether the fuel ignited. If a bullet hit the nitrogen tank, the sudden pressure release could rupture the entire system. Enemy forces quickly learned to prioritize flamethrower operators as targets. The distinctive silhouette of the twin tanks made them easy to identify, and killing an operator before they could deploy their weapon was a tactical priority. The statistics bore this out. On Tarawa, flamethrower operators had a casualty rate exceeding 60%. On Saipan, it was higher. The weapons were effective when they worked, nothing cleared a bunker or cave faster than a burst of liquid fire, but the cost in human life was staggering. Most Marines viewed volunteering for flamethrower duty as either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid, with the prevailing opinion leaning toward the latter. Doctrine reflected this reality. Flamethrowers were assigned to engineer units or special assault teams, men specifically trained for demolitions and fortification reduction. They operated in coordinated attacks with rifle squads providing covering fire, smoke screens obscuring their approach, and careful planning minimizing exposure time. The manual was explicit. Flamethrower operators were not to advance without support, not to expose themselves unnecessarily, and were to withdraw immediately after deploying their weapon. This doctrine made tactical sense. It minimized losses and maximized the weapon's effectiveness. But it also meant flamethrowers were rarely available when and where they were needed most. In the chaotic, fluid combat of the Pacific Islands, where Japanese bunkers and pillboxes appeared in unexpected locations and rapid response was critical, having to wait for engineer units to arrive often meant the opportunity passed. Rifle companies would be pinned down by a single machine gun nest, unable to advance, while the nearest flamethrower team was hundreds of yards away supporting a different assault. Kowalski observed this pattern during the training exercises. He watched rifle squads get bogged down by hypothetical bunker positions, saw how long it took for support weapons to arrive, noticed the frustration in the squad leaders' faces. He also noticed something else. Most riflemen treated the flamethrower with superstitious dread, avoiding even standing near the equipment during demonstrations. It wasn't just the danger. It was the psychological weight of carrying a weapon specifically designed to burn other human beings alive. But Kowalski's mechanic's mind didn't see a terror weapon. He saw a tool with a mechanical problem that could be solved. 3 weeks before the division shipped out for the still unnamed destination, Kowalski approached his platoon sergeant, a career Marine named Gutierrez who'd survived Guadalcanal and Cape Gloucester. "Sergeant, I'd like to volunteer for flamethrower training." Gutierrez looked up from the requisition forms he was reviewing, squinting in the afternoon sun. "Say that again." "Flamethrower training, I want to cross-train as an operator." "Kowalski, you're a rifleman, we need riflemen." "We've got plenty of riflemen, Sergeant. But we only get flamethrowers when the engineers aren't busy, and that's usually too late to matter." Gutierrez studied him for a long moment. "You know the casualty rates." "Oh yes, Sergeant." "You know you'll be carrying 70 pounds of flammable material on your back while people shoot at you." "Oh yes, Sergeant." "You have a death wish I should know about." "No, Sergeant, I think I can operate it better than the engineers." This statement, delivered with complete seriousness and zero arrogance, almost made Gutierrez laugh. "You think you can operate it better? You, a mechanic from Detroit with zero specialized training, can operate a military flamethrower better than Marines who have spent months training specifically for that role." "I didn't say I was better than them, Sergeant. I said I can operate it better. The equipment has problems. I think I can work around them." "The equipment has problems," Gutierrez repeated flatly. "And you, Corporal Kowalski, have identified these problems that the Marine Corps and the engineers who designed the weapons somehow missed." "Not missed, Sergeant, just didn't prioritize fixing in the field." Gutierrez sat back reassessing. Kowalski wasn't being cocky or disrespectful. He was stating what he believed to be facts, the way a mechanic might point out that a truck needed an oil change. There was something almost naive about his confidence, but it wasn't the dangerous kind of naive that got men killed. It was the practical confidence of someone who genuinely believed he understood a mechanical system well enough to improve it. "Why?" Gutierrez asked finally. "Because when we hit the next island, we're going to run into bunkers and fortified positions. That's what these islands are, concrete boxes with machine guns. And every time we get stuck in front of one, men die while we wait for the engineers to bring up a flamethrower or enough explosives to do the job. If I'm carrying one attached to a rifle platoon, we can respond immediately. We don't wait. We don't lose momentum." "And when you get shot?" "Then I get shot, same as any other Marine. But at least I'll have given us a chance to clear the position first." Gutierrez considered this. The logic was sound, even if the premise was insane. The Marine Corps was always short on specialized weapons operators, and having organic flamethrower capability at the platoon level would be tactically valuable. The question was whether Kowalski would survive long enough to make that capability matter. "I'll make some calls," Gutierrez said finally. "But I'm not promising anything. And if you get yourself killed in the first 5 minutes of the landing because you're carrying a giant 'shoot me' sign on your back, I'm going to be very disappointed." "Understood, Sergeant." Kowalski received his orders a week later. Report to the engineer company for cross-training on the M22 flamethrower system. He spent the next 10 days learning the official doctrine, how to carry the weapon, how to approach targets, how to service the equipment, what to do if the ignition failed, how to purge the system, emergency procedures for pressure failures. The engineers were professional and thorough, though several made dark jokes about his life expectancy. Kowalski absorbed everything, asked technical questions about pressure regulation and fuel flow, and on his own time continued studying the mechanical systems. On the last day of training, after he'd qualified on all the official procedures, he approached Corporal Henderson again. "I need a favor." Henderson looked suspicious. "What kind of favor?" "I need about 3 feet of copper wire, thin gauge, and I need to borrow a few tools. I'll return everything." "What for?" "Modifications." Kowalski, we talked about this, you can't modify. It's for my personal weapon, the one I'll be carrying, I'm not touching anyone else's equipment. Henderson hesitated. The regulations were murky on this point. Personal modifications to individual weapons weren't explicitly forbidden, though they weren't encouraged either. Marines did it all the time, wrapping rifle slings differently, adjusting sights, making small changes that suited their preferences. A flamethrower was more complex, but the principle was the same. What are you planning to do? I'm going to add a pressure bleed valve, something I can adjust with my thumb while I'm firing. Give me more control over the flame stream. That's actually not a terrible idea, but if it fails and you blow yourself up, I never saw you. A deal. Henderson scrounged the materials. Kowalski spent that evening carefully installing his modification. A simple valve made from a Japanese canteen cap he'd traded for. The division had collected various enemy equipment from previous campaigns for intelligence and training purposes, and copper wire formed into a spring-loaded release mechanism. The design was crude but functional. By pressing the valve with his thumb, he could bleed off excess nitrogen pressure, reducing the flame stream's intensity and range, but extending the fuel supply and giving him fine control over the weapon's output. He tested it the next morning in an isolated area, with Henderson watching from a safe distance. The first test produced a weak, controlled flame that traveled about 20 feet, half the maximum range but steady and consistent. The second test, with the valve closed, produced the standard maximum pressure gout that reached 45 feet. The third test demonstrated what Kowalski considered the real advantage. He could modulate the pressure midstream, starting with a long-range burst to cover his approach, then dialing it down to a controlled flame for close work, all without releasing the trigger and reigniting. Henderson watched this demonstration with growing interest. That's actually clever. You could save fuel, extend your operational time. And I'm not wasting pressure trying to shoot 50 feet when the target's only 20 feet away. Have you shown this to the lieutenant? Not yet. I wanted to make sure it worked first. You should show him. This could be worth documenting. But Kowalski never got the chance. 3 days later, the division boarded ships and sailed for Iwo Jima. Whatever he was going to prove would have to be proven in combat. Iwo Jima was 8 square miles of volcanic rock and black sand, dominated by Mount Suribachi on the southern tip and rising to a plateau in the north. The island had no strategic value in itself, no resources, no civilian population, no deepwater harbor. Its value lay in geography. It sat directly between the Mariana Islands, where American B-29 bombers were based, and the Japanese home islands. American bombers flying to Japan had to pass near Iwo Jima, where Japanese fighters based on the island's 3 airfields could intercept them. Conversely, if America captured Iwo Jima, those same airfields could provide emergency landing sites for damaged bombers and bases for fighter escorts that could protect the bomber formations all the way to their targets. The Japanese understood this equation perfectly. They'd spent months turning Iwo Jima into one of the most heavily fortified positions in the Pacific. Under the command of Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kurabayashi, the defenders had built a defensive network unlike anything the Americans had encountered before. Instead of defending the beaches, where American naval gunfire and air superiority could devastate them, Kurabayashi ordered his men to dig in deep. They constructed 11 miles of underground tunnels connecting hundreds of caves, bunkers, and pillboxes. They positioned artillery and mortars in caves with overlapping fields of fire, allowing them to cover every square foot of the beaches and inland areas without exposing themselves to counter-battery fire. They built pillboxes with walls 6 feet thick, reinforced with steel and covered with earth and concrete, each one designed to withstand direct hits from naval shells. The defensive plan was simple but brutally effective. Let the Americans land, then kill them slowly through attrition. No banzai charges, no wasteful counterattacks, just methodical, disciplined fire from fortified positions that would bleed the invasion force white. American intelligence had underestimated both the extent of these fortifications and the determination of their defenders. Pre-invasion estimates suggested the island could be secured in 5 days. The reality would be 36 days of some of the most savage fighting in the Pacific War. The landing began at 9:00 a.m. on February 19, 1945. Kowalski went ashore with the 4th Wave, the flamethrower strapped to his back, his M1 Garand rifle slung across his chest for use after his fuel was expended. The beach was chaos, volcanic ash that swallowed men to their ankles, making every step exhausting, while Japanese artillery and mortar fire pounded the beaches with methodical precision. The landing craft's ramp dropped, and Kowalski plunged into shallow water, struggling through surf and ash toward the first terrace, 70 pounds of flamethrower equipment making him clumsy and slow. He made it to cover behind a destroyed Amtrak, joining a cluster of Marines from his platoon. Sergeant Gutierrez was already organizing them, shouting over the explosions. Second squad were moving to that outcropping 50 yards northeast. Third squad covering fire, go. The platoon began its advance, moving by bounds, one group covering while another rushed forward. Kowalski moved with them, struggling with the flamethrowers' weight on the unstable ground. They made it 30 yards before a machine gun opened up from a disguised pillbox to their right, a concrete structure so well camouflaged with volcanic rock and ash that it was invisible until it fired. 2 Marines went down immediately. The rest dove for cover behind rocks and shell craters. Corporal Kowalski, Gutierrez's voice cut through the noise. That's your target, can you get an angle? Kowalski assessed the situation. The pillbox was approximately 40 yards away, its firing port a narrow horizontal slit barely visible in the volcanic rock. Conventional approach would mean crossing open ground while under fire, suicide for anyone, doubly so for a flamethrower operator whose silhouette screamed high-value target. But there was a shallow depression in the ground, a natural drainage channel that ran roughly parallel to their current position before curving toward the pillbox. It would provide partial defilade, enough to get him closer. I can get there, Sergeant. I need covering fire when I make the final approach. You've got it, Thompson Martinez. When Kowalski moves, put everything you've got on that firing port. Don't let them aim. Kowalski checked his equipment one final time. Pressure tank valve open, fuel valve ready, ignition battery charged, his improvised pressure regulator in easy reach of his left thumb. Then he began his crawl, moving through the depression, the flamethrower's tank scraping against volcanic rock, his breathing loud inside his helmet. The crawl took 3 minutes that felt like 30. Japanese bullets cracked overhead, but the angle was wrong for them to hit him directly as long as he stayed low. He reached the point where the depression curved toward the pillbox, 25 yards now, close enough to be effective. He keyed his throat microphone, connected to the platoon's radio. Kowalski in position, preparing to advance on my mark, 3, 2, 1 mark. He surged up and forward rifle fire from his squad, hammering the pillbox's firing port, forcing the Japanese machine gunner to duck back from the aperture. Kowalski covered 15 yards in a stumbling run, dropped behind a volcanic boulder 15 yards from the pillbox, brought the flamethrower nozzle up. The Japanese gunner reappeared at the firing port, machine guns swinging to track him. Kowalski pulled the flamethrower's trigger. The modified pressure system worked exactly as designed. Instead of a maximum pressure gout that would have overshot at this range and wasted fuel, Kowalski's thumb-operated valve bled off enough pressure to create a controlled, sustained stream. The ignited fuel traveled 20 feet, then 15, then arced downward in a precise stream that found the pillbox's firing port and poured inside. The effect was instantaneous. The machine gun went silent, smoke billowed from the firing port, then screaming high-pitched, horrible, brief, then silence. Kowalski held the trigger for 5 seconds, ensuring saturation, then released. The entire engagement had consumed perhaps a quarter of his fuel supply. Standard doctrine would have emptied half the tanks. He just extended his operational capability significantly. Target neutralized, he called out. The platoon moved forward, passing the pillbox. Several Marines paused to look inside, then looked away quickly. Kowalski didn't look, he didn't need to. Gutierrez appeared beside him as they regrouped. Good work, Corporal, how much fuel you got left? About 75%, Sergeant. Gutierrez blinked. 75, you should have used at least half on that shot. I've been making some modifications, better fuel efficiency. Modifications. Gutierrez studied the flamethrower, noticing the crude copper wire valve assembly for the first time. Is that thing safe? Hasn't blown up yet, Sergeant. That's not exactly a ringing endorsement, but if it works, it works. Stay close. Something tells me we're going to need you again before this day is over. Gutierrez was right. Before the sun set on D-Day, Kowalski used his flamethrower 3 more times. Once on a camouflaged spider hole that had allowed a Japanese sniper to kill 2 Marines before his position was identified. once on a small bunker complex that was holding up an entire company's advance, and once on a cave entrance where defenders were staging counterattacks. Each time, his modified pressure system allowed him to conserve fuel and maintain control. Each time, the positions were neutralized quickly and effectively. Word spread through the battalion that night. The new flamethrower operator, the rifleman who'd volunteered for the job, was still alive, still operational, and devastatingly effective. More importantly, he wasn't using the weapon the way the manual prescribed. He was doing something different, something improvised, and it was working. But it was only the first day. The real test would come as the division pushed inland, toward the network of fortifications that constituted Japan's main defensive line. By the third day of the battle, the American advance had stalled. The Marines had secured most of the southern part of the island, including Mount Suribachi, but the northern plateau was a fortress. The Japanese had constructed an interlocking network of pillboxes, each one positioned to support its neighbors, creating overlapping fields of fire that turned every advance into a killing ground. Traditional infantry tactics were proving murderously expensive. Rifle companies would advance, encounter a pillbox, attempt to suppress it with small arms fire, then call for support tanks, artillery, engineers with demolitions or flamethrowers. But the terrain made tank movement difficult, artillery had limited effect on the reinforced positions, and engineers were in desperately short supply. The casualty rates were staggering. The problem was structural. Japanese pillboxes on Iwo Jima were engineering marvels of defensive architecture. They were built from reinforced concrete with walls typically 4 to 6 feet thick. The firing ports were designed as narrow horizontal slits, sometimes with internal baffles that allowed defenders to fire out while making it nearly impossible to fire in. Many pillboxes had multiple firing ports facing different directions, allowing defenders to shift positions based on where the attack was coming from. They were covered with earth and volcanic rock for camouflage, making them invisible until they opened fire. And they were connected by tunnels, meaning that even if you neutralized one position, defenders could retreat through underground passages and reappear elsewhere. Standard doctrine for dealing with pillboxes involved a coordinated assault. Infantry would suppress the position with rifle and machine gun fire, keeping the defenders' heads down, while a demolition team approached with satchel charges or Bangalore torpedoes. Alternatively, flamethrower operators would advance under covering fire and spray burning fuel through the firing ports. Both methods worked when they worked, but they required precise timing, good coordination, and often resulted in significant casualties. Even successful attacks could take hours to plan and execute, during which the entire advance would be stalled. The Marine Corps needed a faster solution. Command began pushing flamethrower teams forward as soon as they encountered pillboxes, hoping to reduce the time needed to neutralize each position. But the supply of trained flamethrower operators was finite, and the casualty rate among those operators was accelerating. By February 23, 4 days into the battle, the division had lost over 40% of its specialized flamethrower operators. The survivors were exhausted, their equipment was wearing out, and the demand for their services far exceeded the supply. Kowalski's platoon had been in continuous combat since the landing, pushing north across terrain that offered minimal cover and maximum danger. On the morning of February 21st, they were assigned to clear a section of the 2nd Defensive Line, a ridge approximately 300 yards long that the Japanese had turned into a fortress. Intelligence reports indicated at least 20 fortified positions along this ridge, with unknown numbers of defenders. The battalion's objective was to breach this line and establish a foothold that follow-on forces could exploit. The attack began at 5:30 a.m., preceded by a 30-minute artillery barrage that accomplished little except to make the Marines feel like they'd tried. The Japanese positions were too deep, too well protected for artillery to reach. When the barrage lifted, the infantry moved forward into a storm of machine gun and rifle fire. Kowalski's platoon was in the second wave, advancing behind the first platoon that was already pinned down 200 yards from the ridgeline. As soon as they moved forward, Japanese fire intensified. Mortars began dropping. The defenders had pre-registered every possible avenue of approach, and they were walking their fire across the advancing Marines with practiced precision. "Get to cover," Gutierrez roared. "First squad left flank behind those rocks. Second squad center use the crater." Kowalski lunged for the crater with 4 other Marines, sliding down its ash-covered slope as a mortar round exploded 20 yards to his right. The explosion showered them with volcanic debris and shrapnel that pinged off the flamethrowers' tanks. For a heart-stopping moment, Kowalski thought he'd been hit, but a quick inspection showed the tanks intact, no leaks, no damage. Lucky. From the crater, he could see the ridge ahead. Multiple pillboxes were visible now that they were firing, gun ports flashing, tracers reaching out across the broken ground, Marines dropping or diving for cover everywhere he looked. The first platoon was completely pinned, unable to advance or retreat, taking casualties from both direct fire and mortars that were systematically searching for them. Gutierrez slid into the crater beside them. "This is a nightmare. We can't advance into that without support." "Where are the tanks?" Private Thompson asked. "Bogged down a quarter-mile south, terrain's too rough." "Engineers." "Working on 3 other positions. We're on our own for at least another hour." "An hour?" Thompson's voice rose. "Sarge, we've got wounded out there who need evac. We can't sit here for an hour." "I know that, Thompson. I'm open to suggestions." Kowalski was studying the pillboxes, his mechanic's mind analyzing the problem. There were 3 positions visible from their location, one directly ahead at 40 yards, one to the left at 60 yards, and one to the right at about 50 yards. They were positioned in a triangle formation, each one able to cover the approaches to the others. Taking out one wouldn't solve the problem, the other 2 would still have overlapping fields of fire. You'd have to neutralize all 3 quickly before the defenders could adjust. "Sergeant," Kowalski said, "I can get those 3 positions." Gutierrez looked at him like he'd suggested walking on water. "All 3? Kowalski, you'd have to cross open ground under fire from multiple angles, hit each position individually, and survive long enough to complete the job. That's not a mission, that's suicide." "Not if we do it right. I've got enough fuel for all 3 if I'm careful with the pressure regulation, and if the squad can suppress while I'm moving." "Even with suppression, you're talking about maybe a 30% chance of making it to the first pillbox. After that, the other 2 will have you zeroed in. You'll be dead before you can engage." "Maybe, but if I don't try, we're stuck here. And the longer we're stuck, the more people die. Those wounded need evac, 1st platoon needs relief, we need to break this position." Gutierrez was silent for a long moment, weighing options. He knew Kowalski was right about the tactical situation. They couldn't stay pinned down, couldn't wait for support that might not arrive in time. But he also knew that ordering a man to undertake an assault with a 30% survival rate was asking him to die. "This is your call," Gutierrez said finally. "I'm not ordering you to do this. If you volunteer, I'll support you. But you need to understand what you're signing up for." Kowalski checked his equipment methodically: pressure tank, fuel level, ignition system, his improvised regulator valve, everything functional. "I understand, Sergeant, let's do it." "All right, here's how we'll run it. 1st squad will establish a base of fire on the left target, 2nd squad on the right target. That'll split their attention. You'll go for the center pillbox first. It's got the most direct line of fire on our position, and taking it out opens up space for us to maneuver. Once that's down, we'll shift fire to whichever target you're moving toward next. Clear?" Clear." "Thompson, Martinez, Chen, you 3 are Kowalski's close cover. You move with him, keep your heads down, and put rounds on target whenever he's static. Don't get heroic, don't get separated, just keep him alive long enough to work." The 3 Marines nodded, expressions grim but determined. Gutierrez keyed his radio. "1st and 2nd squads, listen up. Kowalski's going for the pillboxes. When I give the word, I want every rifle and automatic weapon we have hammering those positions. Don't aim to kill, we can't penetrate those firing ports from this range anyway. Aim to suppress, keep their heads down, give our boy a fighting chance. Acknowledge." The radio crackled with confirmations from both squad leaders. "Kowalski," Gutierrez said, "on your count." Kowalski took 3 deep breaths, forcing his heart rate down, his hands steady on the flamethrower's nozzle and controls. This was it. This was what he'd volunteered for, what he'd spent weeks preparing for. Not for glory, not for recognition, but because it needed to be done and he believed he could do it. 3, he said. 2, 1 marked. The Marines opened fire. The sound was immense. M1 Garand's bars, .30 caliber machine guns, everything they had. Tracers streaked toward the pillboxes, ricocheting off concrete, forcing the Japanese defenders to pull back from their firing ports momentarily. Kowalski erupted from the crater and ran. The first 10 yards were a blur. Kowalski's boots churned through volcanic ash, the flamethrower's 70 pounds pulling at his shoulders and back, his breathing ragged inside his helmet. Behind him, Thompson, Martinez, and Chen were matching his pace, rifles ready. The suppressive fire from the crater was still heavy. He could feel the pressure waves of passing bullets, hear them cracking overhead, but the worst of the fire was aimed high or missing as the Japanese defenders ducked away from the incoming rounds. 15 yards, 20 yards. A Japanese soldier appeared at the center pillbox's firing port, machine guns swinging to track him. Thompson saw it and fired 3 rapid shots at the port, not accurate at this range, not meant to be, but enough to make the defender flinch back for a precious second. 25 yards. Kowalski could see details now, the concrete texture, the camouflage netting, the dark rectangle of the firing port. His thumb found the pressure regulator, adjusted it to mid-range. Not maximum, he couldn't afford to waste fuel on the first target, but enough to be effective. 30 yards. A mortar round exploded to his left, close enough that the concussion knocked Chen off his feet. The private scrambled up, shouting something Kowalski couldn't hear over the ringing in his ears, and kept moving. 35 yards. The Japanese machine gun reappeared at the firing port, muzzle flash visible even in the morning light. Bullets snapped past Kowalski's head, 1, 2, 3. He felt something tug at his sleeve, looked down to see a neat hole through the fabric just below his elbow, no blood, no hit. Lucky again. 40 yards. Kowalski dropped behind a low volcanic outcropping directly in front of the pillbox, gasping for breath. Thompson, Martinez, and Chen threw themselves down beside him, immediately returning fire at the other 2 pillboxes to keep them occupied. "Do it," Thompson yelled, "before they adjust." Kowalski rose to a knee, brought the flamethrower nozzle up, adjusted the regulator for close range, 15 yards, no more, controlled burn. He pulled the trigger. The igniter sparked and the fuel stream caught, a tongue of orange-red flame that lanced out toward the pillbox's firing port with precise, controlled intensity. The stream was narrower than maximum pressure would have produced, but that was the point. Narrow meant focused, focused meant accurate. The flame found the firing port and poured inside like liquid death. The machine gun cut off mid-burst. Screaming erupted from inside the pillbox, high-pitched and horrible. Kowalski held the trigger for 4 seconds, counting mentally, ensuring complete saturation, then released. Smoke billowed from the firing port, thick and black, carrying the smell of burning gasoline, concrete dust, and something organic that his brain refused to identify. "Target 1 down," he called out, moving to target 2. Target 2 was the left pillbox, 60 yards from their original position but only 35 yards from where they were now. The suppressive fire from first squad was still hammering it, but return fire was increasing. The Japanese defenders had figured out what was happening and were trying to stop it. "Covering fire," Gutierrez's voice crackled over the radio. "All weapons on target 2, go Kowalski." He went sprinting along the base of the ridge, using every scrap of cover, the flamethrower bouncing against his back. Thompson, Martinez, and Chen followed, spread out, firing as they moved. A bullet spanged off Kowalski's helmet, not penetrating but ringing it like a bell, sending a spike of pain through his skull and momentarily disrupting his vision. He shook it off, kept running, counted yards, 10, 15, 20. An explosion directly ahead, a grenade thrown from the pillbox. Kowalski dove left, the blast washing over him, shrapnel peppering the flamethrower's tanks. He felt impacts, heard hissing. No, not hissing, his ears ringing from the blast, making phantom sounds. He checked the tanks, frantically dented, scratched, but no leaks. The nitrogen tank's pressure gauge still read normal, still functional. 25 yards to the pillbox. Chen was down, clutching his leg, Martinez dragging him back toward cover. Thompson was still with Kowalski, firing methodically at the firing port. "I'm with you," Thompson shouted. "Keep moving." 30 yards. The pillbox's machine gun was firing in controlled bursts now, searching for them, rounds chewing through volcanic rock just above their heads. Kowalski and Thompson were pinned, unable to advance further without exposure. "Sarge, we need more suppression on target 2, Thompson screamed into his radio. The volume of fire increased. 2 bars from first squad concentrated on the pillbox's firing port, a thunderous hammering that forced the defenders back. Kowalski seized the moment, surged forward the last 10 yards and dropped into position 5 yards from the pillbox, nearly point-blank range. He brought the flamethrower up, checked the regulator, close range. High volume needed for this angle, adjusted, pulled the trigger. The flame stream was wider this time, spreading as it left the nozzle, designed to saturate rather than penetrate. It washed across the pillbox's firing port like a wave, some of it deflecting off the concrete but enough pouring inside to do its work. The machine gun fired one final burst, wild and unaimed, then went silent. More screaming, briefer this time than silence. Target 2 neutralized, Kowalski gasped. He checked his fuel gauge, approximately 40% remaining, enough for the third pillbox if he was careful. Moving to Target 3. Target 3 was the right pillbox, the most distant from their original position. It was also the most alert. The defenders had watched 2 of their supporting positions go down in less than 3 minutes and they knew what was coming. As Kowalski began his approach, fire from that position intensified dramatically. They weren't trying to suppress him or slow him down. They were trying to kill him before he got close. Second Squad's suppressive fire helped, but it wasn't enough. The Japanese defenders were exposing themselves to return fire, taking casualties, but maintaining their position in order to stop the flamethrower operator. It was a calculated trade: lose some men to rifle fire but prevent the flamethrower from reaching effective range. Kowalski made it 20 yards before the fire became overwhelming. Bullets were hitting the ground in front of him, behind him, creating a wall of impacts. He threw himself into a shell crater, landing hard, the flamethrower's weight driving the air from his lungs. Thompson landed beside him a second later. "This isn't working," Thompson shouted. "We can't get close enough." Kowalski's mind raced. The problem was range and exposure. He needed to cover approximately 40 more yards to get into effective range, but those 40 yards were a kill zone. Standard doctrine said pull back, call for support, wait for artillery or tanks or more flamethrowers. Standard doctrine also said men would keep dying while they waited. Then he remembered something from his training, something the engineers had mentioned almost as an afterthought. Maximum range for the M22 was 40 to 50 yards under ideal conditions, maximum pressure, proper angle, level terrain. He'd been using reduced pressure to conserve fuel and improve control. But what if he opened it up? Full pressure, maximum range, and trusted his improvised regulator to handle the stress. "Thompson, I need you to do something for me." "What?" "When I give the word, I need you to throw smoke grenades between us and that pillbox. Every smoke grenade you and the squad have, create a screen." "A screen, Kowalski, they'll just fire blind into the smoke. You'll still get hit." "Not if I'm not in the smoke. I'm going to shoot from here. Maximum range, full pressure." Thompson stared at him. "You're 40+ yards away. The manual says effective range is 30 to 35 yards. The manual's wrong, or at least it's conservative. I can reach that pillbox from here if I max out the pressure and adjust the angle. But I need them blind so they can't pinpoint my position and saturate this crater with fire before I can complete the shot." "As if you're wrong." "Then we pull back and try something else. But if I'm right, we clear this position and open up the entire ridge for the battalion. Thompson, I need you to trust me." Thompson studied him for a heartbeat, then nodded. "You've been right so far. Okay, I'll get the smoke ready." He keyed his radio. "Second Squad, this is Thompson. Break out every smoke grenade you have and stand by to throw on my mark. We're going to screen between our position and Target 3. Acknowledge." Affirmatives came back. Kowalski checked his equipment one more time, fuel gauge at 40%, pressure tank reading good, ignition system charged. He adjusted his position in the crater to get the best possible angle, elevated the nozzle to approximately 30 degrees and set the regulator to maximum pressure, overriding his carefully conserved settings. This was all or nothing. "Thompson, pop smoke." "All units throw smoke." Thompson pulled the pin on his grenade and hurled it toward the pillbox. Other grenades followed from Second Squad's positions, 6, 7, 8 white phosphorus smoke grenades, creating a rapidly expanding cloud between Kowalski's crater and the Japanese position. The enemy fire didn't slacken. If anything, it increased, rounds snapping through the smoke blindly. But the Japanese gunners had lost visual contact, couldn't see exactly where to aim. They were firing at remembered positions at the smoke itself, hoping for lucky hits. Kowalski raised the flamethrower nozzle, aimed high to compensate for the range, checked his angle one final time. This was going to work, it had to work. He pulled the trigger and held it down. Maximum pressure transformed the flamethrower. The fuel stream erupted from the nozzle with tremendous force, the ignited stream arcing high and far, traveling 30 yards, 35-40, still airborne, beginning to break apart at the apex of its trajectory, but maintaining coherence long enough. The flame stream descended onto the pillbox like rain, splashing across the firing port, the roof, the camouflage netting. Some of it missed, falling short or wide, but enough hit the target. The netting caught fire instantly. Fuel poured through the firing port from above, an angle the defenders hadn't anticipated. The machine gun fell silent. Kowalski held the trigger for the full remaining duration of his fuel supply, another 4 seconds, 5, 6, then the stream sputtered and died. The tanks were empty. He'd expended everything on that final shot. For a long moment, nothing happened. The smoke began to clear. The pillbox sat motionless, fire flickering from its firing port and across its camouflaged roof. Then Japanese soldiers erupted from a hidden rear exit, men on fire, screaming, trying to extinguish flames that clung to their uniforms. Marines from 2nd Squad cut them down with rifle fire, quick, brutal, necessary. The position was neutralized. Target 3 down, Gutierrez's voice was almost incredulous. Kowalski, confirmed target 3 is down. Confirmed, Sergeant, target 3 is neutralized. All 3 primary positions are clear. Outstanding work, Corporal, pull back to this position. We're going to consolidate and push through the gap you just opened. Kowalski and Thompson scrambled out of the crater and began the movement back, keeping low, adrenaline still surging through their systems. Chen was being treated by a corpsman, his leg wound painful but not life-threatening. Martinez waved as they approached, grinning despite the chaos. That was the craziest thing I've ever seen, Martinez said. You shot a pillbox from 40 yards away with a flamethrower. That's not even supposed to be possible. It's barely possible, Kowalski admitted. I emptied the entire tank on that last shot. If it hadn't worked, I'd have been useless. But it did work, 3 pillboxes in 5 minutes? You just accomplished what would have taken the whole company an hour and cost us 20 casualties. Gutierrez appeared beside them, looking at Kowalski with an expression that mixed respect, amazement, and mild disbelief. Corporal, I don't know whether to recommend you for a medal or have you examined by a psychiatrist, but whatever you did out there, that jury-rigged pressure valve, that long-range shot, you just broke this defensive line. The colonel is already ordering follow-on forces through. We're going to exploit this breach and push north. This could change the entire tempo of the battle. I just did what needed doing, Sergeant. Yeah, but you did it better than anyone thought possible. Come on, let's get you rearmed and refueled. Something tells me you're going to be busy. By nightfall on February 21st, Kowalski's exploit had become battalion legend. The story spread through the division with the speed of rumors in combat, embellished, exaggerated, but with a core of truth that made it undeniable. A rifleman who'd volunteered for flamethrower duty had single-handedly cleared 3 pillboxes in 5 minutes using an improvised pressure regulation system, including one shot that exceeded the weapon's supposed maximum range by a significant margin. Marines who'd witnessed it vouched for the facts. Officers who'd planned the attack confirmed the tactical impact. By morning, when Kowalski reported for duty with a freshly refilled flamethrower, men he'd never met were pointing him out to each other. That's him, he heard someone whisper. That's the flamethrower guy. The attention made him uncomfortable. He'd done his job, nothing more. The fact that his improvised modifications had worked better than expected was gratifying from a mechanical perspective, but it didn't change who he was, a mechanic from Detroit who happened to be good with equipment. What he didn't fully appreciate was the psychological impact his actions had on the division. Combat on Iwo Jima was grinding, brutal, and exhausting. Every yard was paid for in blood. Every pillbox seemed impregnable. Casualties were mounting, and morale was suffering despite the Marines' determination. In this context, Kowalski's feat represented something vital. Proof that the defenses could be beaten, that individual initiative and ingenuity could make a difference, that the Japanese positions were not, in fact, invulnerable. The division's engineers took particular interest. Word reached Corporal Henderson, who'd helped Kowalski obtain materials for his modifications, and Henderson immediately reported to his commanding officer. By mid-morning on February 22nd, Kowalski was summoned to a briefing with the battalion's engineering officer, a captain named Morrison who'd spent the last 3 days trying to solve the pillbox problem with increasingly desperate tactics. Corporal Kowalski, I've been hearing stories about your flamethrower modifications. I'd like to see them for myself. Kowalski demonstrated the pressure regulation system, the crude valve, the copper wire spring, the thumb-operated control that allowed him to adjust flame intensity on the fly. Morrison examined it carefully. This is remarkably simple. Why hasn't anyone thought of this before? Maybe they have, sir, but it's not standard issue and it's not in the manual. The manual, Morrison's tone was dry. The manual was written by engineers who tested the weapon on flat ranges in California. The manual doesn't account for volcanic ash, variable engagement ranges, or the need to conserve fuel during extended operations. Your modification addresses all of those problems. How reliable is it? I've used it in 4 separate engagements, sir. No failures yet, but it's crude. I made it from scavenged materials. A proper machinist could probably design something better. Maybe, but we don't have time for proper machining. We need solutions now. How difficult would it be to replicate this modification on other flamethrowers? Not difficult, sir. The components are simple. Any Marine with basic mechanical skills could install it in about 20 minutes. Morrison nodded slowly. I'm going to recommend this modification be distributed throughout the division. We'll put together a technical bulletin with instructions, source the materials, and have engineering personnel install the valves on every operational flamethrower we have. If it works as well for others as it's worked for you, we could significantly improve our bunker-busting capability. Are you willing to assist with training other operators? Of course, sir. Good. Report to the engineering platoon after your unit stands down from today's operations. Plan to spend tomorrow training other flamethrower operators on your techniques. That's not a request, Corporal. The division needs this capability distributed as widely as possible, as quickly as possible. Understood, sir. The training session the next day was surreal. Kowalski found himself teaching 20 experienced flamethrower operators, men who'd been doing this job longer than he had, who'd survived longer than average in an extremely high-casualty specialization, about modifications he developed through mechanical intuition and practical experimentation. Some of them were skeptical. Others were interested but cautious. All of them were professional enough to listen and learn. The key is pressure control, Kowalski explained, demonstrating the valve system on his own weapon. Standard doctrine is maximum pressure, maximum range all the time, but that's wasteful. You're burning through fuel trying to shoot 50 yards when most of your targets are 20 to 30 yards away. By bleeding off excess pressure, you can dial the flame stream down to exactly what you need, shorter range but more control and much longer operational time. What about when you need maximum range? One operator asked. Are you saying we should never use full pressure? No, I'm saying you should use full pressure when you need it, but not as your default setting. Assess each target individually. Close pillbox at 15 yards, dial it down. Distant target at 40 yards, max it out. You're in control, that's the point. You're not limited to one setting anymore. Another operator raised his hand. What about the safety concerns? Modifying equipment in the field can cause malfunctions. That's true, but this modification is external to the main pressure system. You're adding a secondary valve, not changing how the primary system works. If the valve fails, worst case is it stays closed and you're back to standard operation. It can't cause an explosion or rupture the tanks. The pressure relief is always venting away from the operator. They spent 6 hours on the training range that day, each operator installing the modification on their own weapon under Kowalski's supervision, then testing it through a series of live-fire exercises. By the end of the session, skepticism had largely evaporated. The modification worked. It was simple, reliable, and effective. Several operators made small improvements to Kowalski's design, refining the valve placement or adjusting the spring tension for their personal preferences. It was becoming doctrine through practical experimentation, grassroots innovation rather than top-down implementation. That evening, Captain Morrison submitted his report to division headquarters. He recommended formal adoption of the pressure regulation modification for all M22 flamethrowers in theater, with Kowalski's improvised design serving as the template. He also recommended that Corporal Kowalski be recognized for his contribution to tactical effectiveness and his role in training other operators. The next morning, Kowalski was back on the line with his platoon, flamethrower freshly refueled, ready for another day of combat, but something had shifted. Other units were now using the modification. Other operators were conserving fuel, extending their operational time, approaching targets with the same calculated control he'd demonstrated. The tactical impact was measurable. Bunker clearing operations that had taken hours were now taking minutes. Casualty rates among infantry assaulting fortified positions were dropping. The Japanese defensive network, while still formidable, was no longer the impenetrable fortress it had seemed 4 days earlier. And at the center of this tactical evolution was a mechanic from Detroit who'd seen a problem and fixed it, the same way he'd fixed hundreds of car engines before the war. The battle for Iwo Jima lasted 36 days. By March 26, 1945, the island was declared secure, though isolated pockets of Japanese resistance continued for months afterward. American casualties totaled over 26,000, including nearly 7,000 dead, some of the highest casualty rates of any battle in the Pacific War. Japanese casualties were even more severe. Of the approximately 21,000 defenders, fewer than 1,000 were captured alive. The rest fought to the death, exactly as Lieutenant General Kurabayashi had ordered. Kowalski survived the entire campaign. This itself was statistically remarkable. Flamethrower operators as a group suffered casualty rates exceeding 70% during the battle. But Kowalski's modifications, combined with his careful, methodical approach to each engagement, kept him alive when others fell. He cleared an estimated 47 fortified positions during the 36-day battle, ranging from small spider holes to major pillbox complexes. His fuel consumption rate was roughly 40% lower than standard operators, meaning he could stay operational longer and engage more targets per refuel. His modification became standard issue for Marine flamethrower units in the Pacific Theater, eventually incorporated into official doctrine and training materials. But the numbers, impressive as they were, didn't capture the full story. What mattered was the tactical flexibility his innovation provided. Infantry platoons could now carry organic flamethrower capability without accepting the traditional trade-offs of rapid fuel depletion and limited operational time. This changed how attacks were planned and executed, allowing for more fluid, responsive tactics rather than rigid, time-consuming set-piece assaults. It saved lives, not just American lives, though those certainly mattered, but also shortened the battle's duration, which ultimately saved Japanese lives as well by reducing the time defenders spent in hopeless resistance. On March 15, 1945, Corporal Kowalski was promoted to sergeant and awarded the Silver Star for his actions on February 21. The citation specifically mentioned his exceptional initiative in modifying equipment under combat conditions, resulting in significantly improved tactical effectiveness and reduced casualties among friendly forces. He was also recommended for transfer to a training unit to teach his techniques to new flamethrower operators preparing for the invasion of Japan. He declined the transfer. His platoon was short of experienced NCOs, and he felt his place was with the men he'd fought alongside for months. Command accepted his decision with what Sergeant Gutierrez later described as reluctant respect. The last time Kowalski used his flamethrower in combat was March 21, 1945, in the island's northern highlands. A small group of Japanese defenders had barricaded themselves in a complex of caves and were refusing surrender, instead making nighttime raids on nearby American positions. The division commander wanted the position neutralized quickly. The island was essentially secured, and he didn't want to lose more men to holdouts in the final days of the battle. Kowalski's platoon was assigned the mission. They approached the cave complex at dawn, moving carefully through terrain that was by now depressingly familiar: volcanic rock, black sand, the smell of death, and cordite. The caves were in a hillside, multiple entrances at different elevations, connected by internal passages. Standard doctrine would have been to seal the caves with demolitions, burying the defenders alive. But there was hope that surrender might be negotiated if the right pressure was applied. Gutierrez positioned the platoon in a semicircle around the main cave entrance, rifles trained on the opening. He called out in Japanese. One of the division's interpreters had taught him basic phrases, offering surrender terms. The response was a grenade that rolled out of the cave and exploded 30 feet from the nearest Marine, doing no damage but making the defenders' intentions clear. "Your call, Sergeant Kowalski," Gutierrez said, using the new rank. "We can demo them or you can clear them." Kowalski studied the cave entrance. It was largely 10 feet wide, 7 feet high, sloping downward into darkness. Multiple chambers visible from the entrance plus unknown passages beyond. This was going to require careful work, methodical clearing, significant fuel consumption. He checked his tanks, full load, 4 gallons, enough. "I'll clear them, but I need 2 men with me for security, in case there are side passages I can't cover with the flamethrower." Thompson Martinez, you're with Sergeant Kowalski. The rest of us will provide cover from here. You run into trouble, you back out immediately. We're not losing people this close to the end. Clear. A clear, Sergeant. The three-man team approached the cave entrance in tactical formation, Kowalski in the center with the flamethrower, Thompson and Martinez on either flank with rifles ready. They paused at the entrance, listening. Voices inside, speaking Japanese, too quiet to make out words. Movement in the darkness. The defenders knew they were coming. Kowalski adjusted his pressure regulator to medium setting. This was close work in confined spaces, no need for maximum range. He checked the ignition, then stepped into the cave. The transition from sunlight to darkness was disorienting, but his eyes adjusted quickly. The cave opened into a large chamber approximately 20 feet deep with multiple passages leading deeper. He could see shapes moving in the shadows, couldn't count how many. A shot rang out, the muzzle flashed brilliant in the darkness, the bullet ricocheting off the cave wall somewhere to his left. He pulled the trigger. The flamethrower illuminated the cave like daylight, the flame stream casting wild, dancing shadows as it swept across the chamber. He targeted the passage where the shot had come from, poured fire into the opening for 3 seconds, then released and swept to the next passage, repeated the process. The cave filled with smoke and the smell of burning, but he could still see, could still maneuver. Japanese soldiers emerged from the side passages, some firing, some just running, trying to escape the flames. Thompson and Martinez engaged with rifles, precise two-shot bursts, men dropping. Kowalski kept moving forward, clearing each passage methodically, his training and experience making the process almost automatic. Identify threat, assess range, adjust pressure, fire, assess effect, move to next target. A Japanese officer appeared from a side chamber, sword raised, screaming something unintelligible, charging directly at Kowalski. Thompson shot him twice in the chest, the officer collapsing 5 feet away, the sword clattering on volcanic rock. They pushed deeper into the cave system, clearing 3 chambers, 5-7. Some defenders fought to the death. Others, trapped and disoriented by the flames and smoke, surrendered when given the opportunity. By the time they reached the final chamber at the back of the cave complex, Kowalski's fuel gauge read 10% remaining. Good timing, he'd calculated about right. The final chamber was empty except for a wounded Japanese soldier, young, maybe 19 years old, lying against the back wall with a stomach wound that was clearly mortal. He looked up as the Americans entered, his expression not frightened but simply tired, accepting. He said something in Japanese, too quiet for them to hear. Kowalski lowered his flamethrower. Get the corpsman, this one might make it if we treat him fast. They brought the corpsman, who worked quickly, efficiently, doing what he could. The Japanese soldier died anyway 20 minutes later in the cave he defended far from home. Kowalski watched him die, feeling nothing in particular. It wasn't that he didn't care, he did in an abstract way. But after 34 days of continuous combat, after clearing 47 positions, after burning alive more enemy soldiers than he could count, his emotional capacity for processing death had been exhausted. There was only the job, only the mission, only the mechanical process of survival and mission accomplishment. They withdrew from the caves, reported the position cleared, collected 13 Japanese prisoners who'd surrendered during the assault. By noon, the platoon was back at their bivouac area, cleaning equipment, writing reports, trying to process the fact that the battle was essentially over. That evening, Gutierrez found Kowalski sitting alone, staring at his flamethrower, which he'd just finished servicing and cleaning. "You all right, Sergeant?" "Fine, just tired." "You've been carrying that thing for over a month now. 47 positions cleared, plus training duties, plus the regular rifle work when you're not using the flamethrower. That's exceptional." "It's just equipment, I know how it works so I use it effectively. Nothing exceptional about that." "Kowalski, you turned a suicide weapon into a precision tool. You invented a modification that the entire Corps is now adopting. You've probably saved hundreds of lives, American and Japanese both, by shortening engagements and making them less costly. That's exceptional whether you want to acknowledge it or not." Kowalski was quiet for a moment. "I just fixed something that was broken, same thing I did in Detroit, different equipment but same principle. Find the problem, design a solution, test it, implement it. That's all it was." "Maybe, but you did it under fire, under conditions where most people would have just accepted the equipment as is and done their best with what they had. You saw a better way and made it happen. That's engineering under pressure. That's innovation in combat that matters." "I suppose." Gutierrez studied him, recognizing the flat affect, the emotional exhaustion. The kid was burnt out, running on discipline and routine rather than any genuine enthusiasm. That was normal, most of them were burnt out by now. The important thing was he was still functional, still capable. We're shipping out soon, back to Hawaii for refit and rest. Rumor is we're preparing for Japan itself. When we get there, they're going to want you training more flamethrower operators. Your techniques need to be disseminated as widely as possible before the next operation. I know. You don't have to like it, you just have to do it. I know that too, Sergeant. Gutierrez clapped him on the shoulder and walked away, leaving Kowalski alone with his thoughts and his flamethrower. In the gathering twilight, the weapon looked innocuous, just metal tanks and hoses and a nozzle, nothing particularly threatening. But Kowalski knew better. He'd seen what it could do, seen the fear it inspired, seen positions that had held for days crumble in seconds when that distinctive roar announced its presence. He'd turned it from a crude terror weapon into a precision instrument. He'd proved that innovation didn't require laboratories or formal credentials, just observation and the willingness to try something different. He'd survived 36 days of combat that killed or wounded 70% of the men in his role. And he'd do it again when the time came, because that's what the job required. The invasion of Japan never came. 2 atomic bombs and the Soviet Union's declaration of war convinced the Japanese government to accept unconditional surrender in August 1945. Sergeant James Kowalski was part of the occupation forces that landed in Japan in September, peacefully this time, to a country that had stopped fighting. He spent 6 months in occupation duty, mostly administrative work, equipment maintenance, helping to rebuild and reorganize. His flamethrower sat in storage, unneeded. In March 1946, he was discharged and returned to Detroit to his uncle's automotive shop, to the life he'd left behind. He never talked much about the war. When pressed, he'd share basic facts: served in the Pacific, fought on Iwo Jima, did his job, came home. He didn't mention the flamethrower, didn't mention the modifications, didn't mention that his innovations had been written into official Marine Corps doctrine and training manuals. It was just something he'd done, a problem he'd solved, nothing particularly noteworthy from his perspective. But the Marine Corps remembered. His techniques were taught to every flamethrower operator through the 1950s and 1960s, until the weapons themselves were phased out in favor of other systems. Engineering officers studied his improvised pressure regulation system as an example of field innovation, practical problem-solving under combat conditions. Military historians analyzing the Iwo Jima campaign noted how the introduction of improved flamethrower techniques in late February 1945 had contributed to breaking Japanese defenses and accelerating the battle's conclusion. In 1985, 40 years after the battle, the Marine Corps invited Kowalski to a reunion of Iwo Jima veterans. He attended reluctantly and found himself surrounded by men who remembered him or remembered stories about him, passed down through the division's oral history. The flamethrower sergeant who'd cleared 3 pillboxes in 5 minutes. The mechanic who'd redesigned his weapon in the field. The man who'd made the impossible routine. "You saved my life," one veteran told him at the reunion, a former rifle platoon sergeant named Collins. "We were pinned down on the 3rd day, couldn't move forward or back, and your technique got us unstuck in 15 minutes instead of the hours it would have taken otherwise. I went home because of that. I had kids because of that. They've got kids now. All because you figured out a better way to clear a bunker." Kowalski didn't know what to say to that. He'd just fixed a mechanical problem. He'd just done his job. The ripple effects, lives saved, families created, futures enabled, were too abstract to process emotionally. "I'm glad you made it home," he said finally, because that seemed appropriate. The reunion organizers presented him with a plaque commemorating his service and his innovations. He thanked them, took it home, and put it in a drawer. It wasn't that he didn't appreciate the recognition, he did, in an intellectual way. But the experiences it commemorated were so far removed from his current life that they felt like someone else's memories, someone else's war. James Kowalski died in 2003 at the age of 81, quietly at home, surrounded by family who knew him as a husband, father, and grandfather who'd run a successful automotive shop for 50 years. His obituary mentioned his military service in 2 sentences. Served in the U.S. Marine Corps during World War II. Fought at Iwo Jima. But in the Marine Corps archives, in the training manuals and historical analyses, his legacy endured. The pressure regulation modification he'd invented with scavenged materials and mechanical intuition remained in doctrine long after the weapons themselves were retired. His combat record, 47 fortified positions cleared, survival rate anomalously high for his specialty, Silver Star for initiative and innovation under fire, became a case study in tactical adaptation and field engineering. He'd proven that sometimes the best solutions don't come from laboratories or engineering departments or formal development programs. Sometimes they come from a mechanic who sees a problem, understands the underlying mechanics, and has the courage to try something different even when experts and doctrine say it won't work. On Iwo Jima, when officers doubted whether flamethrowers could ever be more than suicide weapons, when engineers accepted high casualty rates as unavoidable, when doctrine treated the M22 as a crude instrument of terror, one corporal saw a pressure regulation problem and fixed it the same way he'd fixed broken carburetors in Detroit. The Japanese defenders learned to fear that distinctive roar. American infantry learned to trust it. And the Marine Corps learned that innovation in combat isn't about credentials or formal authority. It's about observation, ingenuity, and the willingness to prove your ideas work by putting them into action when it matters most. No one ever doubted flamethrowers again. Not after Sergeant Kowalski showed them what the weapon could become in the hands of someone who understood both its mechanics and its tactical possibilities. His legend endures not in monuments or public recognition, but in the quiet efficiency of a solution so elegant that it became invisible, absorbed into doctrine, taught to thousands, saving lives in ways that could never be precisely calculated. He was a mechanic who went to war, saw a machine that didn't work properly, and fixed it with copper wire and common sense. On a volcanic island 8,000 miles from Detroit, James Kowalski proved that sometimes the greatest innovations come not from those with the most credentials, but from those with the clarity to see what's broken and the courage to make it right. The flamethrower's roar became his signature. Its efficiency became his legacy. And his name, largely forgotten by history, remained written in the survival of men who came home because bunkers fell faster, because fuel lasted longer, because one Marine refused to accept that the weapon had to be a death sentence.